There are instances where pupils can have a pretty traumatic experience, right, in school, and that's might be few and far between. But in terms of maths, it might be just one experience where they feel humiliated or embarrassed or what have you, and that can have a really kind of damaging and long-term effect.
Welcome to the Leading With podcast. I'm Jon Cripwell, National Education Lead for Primary Maths at Twinkl and host of the Primary Maths podcast. And today I'm joined by Associate Professor of Psychology, Dr. Thomas Hunt from the University of Derby. He's an expert in the field of maths anxiety and has led the Maths Anxiety Research Group, spending the last 22 years, I think we worked out, Tom, exploring how emotional responses to mathematics affect learners of all ages and what we can do about it. Tom, thank you so much for joining us today, and it's great to have you here with us, and we're looking forward to learning a little bit more about maths anxiety, the impact it has in schools, and how as school leaders we can support staff and pupils to build confidence and reduce fear around maths.
Thanks for having me.
So you've obviously dedicated much of your career to understanding maths anxiety in general, I think. Can we rewind a little bit to start with? So at school, did you enjoy maths? Did that lead into your current area of research?
It's an interesting one, really, because I would say I was pretty ambivalent towards maths at school. It was something that I was kind of okay at. I didn't particularly struggle, but equally I didn't particularly enjoy it as such. I think there were aspects in secondary school where I started to enjoy it because I was around other people who were starting to enjoy it. I sort of distanced myself really from maths. Chose subjects after leaving school that didn't involve too much maths. I studied business at A level, for example, which included elements of maths, as you might expect, and I was okay at that, but I didn't pursue mathematics as such. It wasn't until I was an undergraduate studying psychology that we started to learn about this thing called mathematical cognition. So all about how, as people, we might store numerical facts, for example, within our brain, how we access numerical information. And as part of that, we started to learn about the role of emotion. Okay, so I started to sort of think back to my own experiences at this point at primary school. And one or two experiences around panic, for example, started to kind of make sense to me. And I kind of thought, I wonder how many other people maybe have experienced similar things. Although I was never a particularly maths anxious person, it was just those little snippets, little experiences with certain teachers where I perhaps did feel a little bit upset, a bit anxious, that I kind of thought, okay, there's something in this. There was researchers at the time had started to look into it. And that's when I did my own undergraduate research project in maths anxiety. And it kind of went from there, really. So as a psychologist, I'm interested in the application of psychological knowledge to mathematical experiences, essentially. And as I say, kind of linking that to my own experiences, even in that small way, helped me make sense of where I got to at that point in my mathematical journey, but also really understanding other people in terms of maybe some more extreme reactions or experiences, and ultimately, what can we do to kind of help?
So you've recently written a book, Tom, on maths anxiety. It's called Maths Anxiety, Solving the Equation, and you've written that with your co-author, Heidi Kirkland. Within the book, you make the case that there's a difference between maths anxiety and struggling with maths at school. I wondered if you could just elaborate on that a little bit for us.
Yeah, so I think it's a common misconception that struggling with mathematics means that you are automatically anxious about it, or vice versa. I think naturally, if you struggle with something, that's going to create a certain degree of stress, and that can develop into anxiety. But if we look across multiple studies, for example, and we start to draw this kind of picture of the relationship between, say, maths attainment and maths anxiety, there is a correlation there. Typically people who are maths anxious will, on the whole, perform slightly worse than those who aren't maths anxious.
And that makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah,
Because if you
makes
don't
sense.
enjoy it and you're worried about it, it's not going to help your attainment.
Absolutely. But what that correlation is it's not so big that we sort of say, look, actually struggling with maths is the thing that's going to make you anxious. It's a relatively weak, relationship. It's just fairly consistent. So there is a really big, distinction between struggling with the subject and feeling anxious, about it. And ultimately, there are people who are still, high achievers when it comes to maths, but it might be that they struggle, but at a higher level, if that makes sense. And ultimately, struggle is always going to be there if you are continuously being stretched. Right? Yep. It kind of makes sense in that way. So what we're talking about really is a range of other psychological variables that need to be considered. In terms of things like resilience, motivation, attitudes. To just look at this sort of distinction between struggle and anxiety on its own really misses out all of those other psychological things that sort of make it important, really.
So could you be somebody who finds maths difficult but are not particularly anxious about that, and equally somebody who is relatively high attaining in maths but still has anxiety around the subject?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I say, if we look at across the piece, when we sort of amalgamate data across, different levels of attainment and across different sort of, demographics, we see obviously a relationship there between maths anxiety and maths attainment. But what that does is it misses out all sorts of individual profiles, where we've got students, for example, even adults, young children, who have different degrees of motivation. And it's often the case that, yes, you might struggle, but you're equally not particularly bothered about that, and you don't necessarily have the anxiety that comes with it. And the flip side of that is, you might be on a degree course, a higher level qualification in maths. You're around other people who are also technically high achievers, and for some reason anxiety can still be there. And there's lots of reasons for that.
You mentioned adults struggling with maths or anxiety around maths there. And obviously, as school leaders, we work with lots of teachers and teaching assistants and other adults within school. Do you think, is there something that we should be aware of as as school leaders? I'll say that again. Is there something that we should be aware of as school leaders when it comes to adults and maths anxiety in school?
Yeah, certainly. I think, there's enough research now to demonstrate a link between adults' maths anxiety, maths attitudes, confidence, and also what we see in pupils. And that's the same for, parents and teachers as well. So if we talk about the home numeracy environment, for example, we can see links there between parents and children, but equally in the classroom, we can see a relationship between, teachers' own confidence, anxiety, and, like I say, what we see within the children as well.
If you have an adult working in school that is less confident in their maths ability themselves, or their own story that they tell themselves about how they are with maths, that can have an impact, it seems, in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we look at some studies that have really looked at big data, so across multiple countries, it's a very clear pattern in terms of a relationship between the teacher's own confidence, the pupils' kind of perceived competence of the teacher as well, and what we see in the pupils in terms of their maths attainment, their own maths anxiety. Now the question is, how that occurs really, because I think that we know that there is a relationship, but trying to unpack that in terms of cause and effect is another thing. And it's a little bit of speculation, but I think that things are happening over a period of time, very subtle things, inadvertent things. No teacher is going to kind of set out thinking, I want to cause anxiety in the pupils. Obviously the reverse is true. Yet something is going on there, over the course of, a few months or a school year or whatever. And, again, there's some interesting studies that have demonstrated that, at the start of a school year, for instance, there might not be a relationship between the teacher's maths anxiety and the pupils' maths anxiety, yet we start to see this develop over time. So as I say, the question is, how is that occurring? Is it that the pupils are almost, picking up subtle cues in terms of the teacher's own confidence or anxiety, or is the teacher themselves maybe behaving in a particular way, sort of giving off almost vibes of feeling anxious? Or it could be that their teaching style, their methods is even subtly different because of their own confidence or anxiety.
That's really interesting. We talk a lot about how we can build a culture within schools that is conducive to children feeling that they can take risks and that they don't have to get everything right all of the time. Is that something that's likely to have an impact on somebody who feels anxious about maths? Is that a way in to start to support those?
I think so, yeah. I mean, if we look at things like resilience, for example, and what we mean by resilience, this perception of the importance of struggle is a big part of that. And we see that relationship there in terms of, higher anxious pupils maybe having that perception that struggle isn't important, and perhaps that feeds into this notion that you just have to get it right straight away every time. So, this is something that I think can be sort of built up in terms of culture. Maybe the emphasis on maybe not getting things right every time and really learning from mistakes, using mistakes as a learning tool. But I think equally in terms of the teachers, this is something that perhaps needs to be, thought about as well, because there is always this almost, unwritten rule that the teacher knows everything, when it comes to mathematics. They're the ones that are perfect, that they're almost not human, and as humans we do get things wrong. And, I think
Trust me, Tom, if you ever saw me teaching, you would see me getting things wrong. Obviously always on purpose to draw attention to a misconception, but that they would be there. So that idea of the infallible teacher is perhaps not a helpful one. I just wonder whether, so again, a lot of the work that's been going on in schools around teaching for mastery and approaches to teaching maths has focused on not having closed questions that are very definitive in their right or wrong answer, and also in sort of evaluating pupil responses, not just taking the answer as being right or wrong and moving on, but actually exploring whether it's right or wrong, taking some time to unpick it a little bit further. Are those sorts of approaches, do you think, helpful for pupils?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is a big part of how maths anxiety might develop over time. There are instances where pupils can have a pretty traumatic experience, right, in school, and that's might be few and far between. But in terms of maths, it might be just one experience where they feel humiliated or embarrassed or what have you, and that can have a really kind of damaging and long-term effect. But in most pupils, they perhaps don't have those more pronounced experiences, but there are lots of subtle experiences that kind of accumulate over time. And the thing that I think kind of feeds into some of those more negative experiences is this sense of maths having this right or wrong answer, and certain problems that are posed in an evaluative sense. Okay, so this kind of continuous assessment of pupils, not necessarily in a formal assessment style, but the constant question setting, and particularly in a kind of public format, so in a classroom, for instance, that sense of right or wrong can really over time build up a sense of self in terms of, okay, this is how I am as a mathematician, this kind of self-concept. And particularly in terms of a hierarchy as well within the classroom. Very young children are good at sort of placing themselves in a particular position. And I think, as you say, those kind of closed questions, particularly in the kind of constant, assessment of pupils, can really feed into that sense of self, that sense of hierarchy. And what that does over time is it just strengthens that sense of self. If you perform at a particular level, it might reinforce your sense of, okay, I'm not a mathematician, or I'm one of the worst, in inverted commas, in my class or in my group. And I think these subtle effects build up over time that, as I say, really reinforce that sense of self-concept, mathematical self-concept, but also feed into the anxiety as well. So, one thing that we can start to do is really think outside the box, maybe not take for granted, how we constantly assess, essentially, in mathematics as part of that kind of learning and teaching strategy, but to really think, okay, what are the kinds of mathematical problems that are being posed here, and ultimately what is being assessed? Is it that end product, or is it something else along the way? And as I say, very subtly, it's not the formal assessment, it's all of the assessment, the evaluation in between that isn't necessarily framed as assessment, but is being perceived as assessment, by the pupils. That's the thing I think we need to focus on.
Yeah, I think children adults are very good at identifying their own, as you say, sort of place within that hierarchy in the classroom. And it doesn't matter, I think it doesn't help if you're sitting in ability seating, for example, or setting maybe. I've always preferred mixed ability because I think it can have lots of benefits, including for mathematical talk and peer support and things like that. But I think another contributing factor is possibly that idea of self-worth. If I'm sat on, we used to call it red table, I know very definitively where I am in the classroom and how that compares to my peers. I was speaking about your book, writing about your book on LinkedIn because I was reading it on a train down to an event in London, and I happened to post about it and said that I found this really accessible book. And somebody challenged me and said, maths anxiety isn't a real thing. It's just, you could be anxious about anything. You could be anxious about baking a cake and is it going to come out nicely in the oven and things. So as somebody who spent 20 years working on maths anxiety and leads a maths anxiety research group, what would you say to somebody who is sceptical about the idea of maths anxiety? Maybe you could just, I'm conscious I haven't really asked what maths anxiety is, and that was probably helpful, but so maybe you could just elaborate, what is maths anxiety and is it a real thing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, firstly, it's a perfectly understandable question, to be honest. And I think if we look at many phobias, we could often sort of say, well, it's irrational. Many phobias are irrational by nature. We might have a fear of, I don't know, buttons, for example. Whatever it might be, and that's because there's nothing inherently scary about the thing that sometimes people are afraid of. And I think the same thing happens with mathematics. Many children start off really enjoying numbers and mathematics, and what we start to see is anxiety builds up towards that subject over time. So I think it depends how we look at this really in many ways. So firstly, it's not necessarily anxiety towards the mathematics per se, unless it's in more extreme circumstances where we do start to see almost a phobic reaction sometimes to mathematical stimuli, if you like, numbers and mathematical information. But largely speaking, the anxiety is around the mathematics in context, in terms of, for example, being assessed in mathematics or being in some kind of evaluative setting, or where there's some kind of perceived consequence to getting the mathematics wrong, if you like. And that does sound like a lot of test anxiety, that it's just test anxiety, and it's not quite that, because often what we see is that especially pupils within school, they might still perform okay or even quite well in other subject areas. And if the problem was largely just test anxiety, so being in that kind of test situation, we would see a little bit more of a similar effect, if you like, across subject areas. So where we start to see the effect is more pronounced in mathematics, it clearly suggests that something else is going on there within that subject area, and maybe it's around that person's relationship with maths that's important. And in terms of the anxiety response itself, I mean, it's very multifaceted, for a start. So I'm sure people are familiar with the anxiety response in terms of particularly the psychophysiological side of things. So feeling hot, feeling sweaty, you might sometimes feel your heart begin to race and that kind of thing. And we do see cases where Pupils are physically anxious, they feel physically unwell in response to something mathematical. And that might be that fear of going to a maths classroom, it might be a fear of a maths test, it might be that kind of build up even over time. It doesn't have to be in the moment, it could be the night before and starting to, for example with young children, have stomachache or headaches because they know they've got mathematics the next day. And again, we don't necessarily see that in many other subjects. This is something that seems to be very pronounced and commonplace with mathematics, which obviously is a real shame, because as I say, mathematics is ubiquitous, it's all around us, it's a big part of our lives. And as I say, many children grow up actually enjoying numeracy activities. So something is going wrong for some people at some point down the line. But as I say, it affects people in different ways. It could be that some people have those pronounced physiological sort of reactions. Other people, it could largely be cognitive in terms of worry and intrusive thoughts. And again, many of us have experienced this in other domains. But for some, it might be to do with mathematics, and rather than being able to focus on the teacher or a maths task, they're sat there worrying, I hope I don't get asked a question, or what if I get these questions wrong, or what if I'm slower than my friends? And these kinds of thoughts can really interfere with the processes that we need to actually focus on the mathematics. And of course, you've got things like panic as well. The more you panic, the more anxious you feel, and that really creates this kind of vicious cycle in many ways. So in terms of the what maths anxiety is, it is multifaceted. It affects people in different ways. We see an effect quite often within mathematics, what we call an affective drop in performance. So this kind of deterioration, particularly under high stakes testing, that we don't see in other areas. But also, if we start to look at almost kind of concrete evidence, if you like, we see empirical support for activity in the brain. Amongst those who are highly maths anxious, their brains appear to activate in or even deactivate in particular ways compared to those who are low in maths anxiety. And if we look at something like self-reported maths anxiety, we see a relationship with, as I say, psychophysiological reactivity, the way that the body responds to mathematical tasks as well. So we've got sort of test performance, self-report evidence, and also brain and body data that really reinforces this idea that maths anxiety is a distinct construct. And particularly if we look at the relationship between maths anxiety and other anxieties, so from a self-report point of view, as you would expect, there's a relationship there. Maths anxiety relates to test anxiety, general anxiety, but the relationship isn't strong enough that actually they're one and the same. Right. Okay, the relationships there are pretty consistent actually across different age groups, different phases of education, etc., different demographics. And you would want there to be a relationship. If there wasn't a relationship with, say, test anxiety, I would question whether maths anxiety is an anxiety, or maybe it's something else. So the fact that it's correlated with those other anxieties kind of reinforces that this is an anxiety to begin with. But because the relationship isn't so strong, it also differentiates it from those other anxieties. So there's plenty of evidence to kind of say, look, this is an anxiety, but it's certainly separate from the other anxieties that we typically see.
And how many people are affected? And I know that's not a definitive number, but typically, what would you expect?
It's a really difficult one to answer, because often we use this language of how many people are maths anxious, and that kind of in many ways categorises people as being in one group or another. And the reality is, like with many anxieties, it's on a continuum. So if we were to plot self-report data, for example, what we see is not quite a normal distribution, but a slight skew towards the bottom end. So the majority of people will score towards the lower end of anxiety, but we see this gradual increase in scores within any given population, or most populations, and then a gradual kind of tailing off towards the higher end. So in terms of a percentage, it's really difficult to sort of say, look, this percentage have high anxiety, because what do we mean by high anxiety. We don't quite have the normative data to be able to sort of say, look, this is a cut-off, if you like, for high anxiety. But I think if you start to look at how the data are plotted in terms of the distribution, what we do see is that lots of pupils will experience it. And if you look at researchers in the field over time, they've attempted to put a percentage on it. And what you find is that percentage is highly variable, because it ultimately depends what they're talking about. Are they talking about high maths anxiety, or are they talking about higher than a typical average? Well, that average might vary from one group of people to another. So it's almost a bit risky to kind of say, look, this is a percentage that is maths anxious. It's much more, I guess, useful to understand where any given individual is at one point in time, and how that anxiety changes.
So looking at it on an individual basis,
Yep.
And looking at that pupil or adult as a whole, and thinking.
Yeah, I'd say so. And also, we need to bear in mind, what maths anxiety are we talking about? Because we often talk about it as one thing. The reality is that it is multifaceted. So you might score higher on a particular subscale of a self-report questionnaire compared to another. So it could be that you score very highly on maths evaluation anxiety, for instance, where your anxiety towards maths is being driven by being evaluated in maths, and this might be compared to anxiety around maths in everyday life, or even a more kind of passive maths anxiety. So we see sometimes people are very anxious just being around maths, in those more extreme circumstances. So hearing maths conversations, for example, just listening to the teacher talk about maths. So it really depends, what type, if you like, of maths anxiety we're talking about as well.
Okay. So what I'm interested in is, we were talking earlier, Tom, before we started recording, about children. I've worked with children in early years settings, and in reception and nursery, we've got to the point now where in many settings we've removed the maths area, because there's a growing understanding that maths is sort of intrinsic in the world. And when you're looking at pattern making and understanding number and things, it's all around us. And the skill of the early years practitioner really is in recognising that and creating the opportunities with children. And it's very rare, I would suggest, that you get a child at that age that has any fear of maths at all. It's just another part of school and their understanding of the world. So what are the environmental factors, do you think, in your opinion, that cause somebody as they go through school to become more, and you may have already touched on this with the evaluation side, are there any other factors? I'm thinking about parents' attitudes and those sorts of things.
Yeah, I think there are many factors at the individual level, for example, where people are starting off and how they develop in terms of their own almost personality in a way. So the extent to which people are already prone to anxiety. I think, things like motivation levels, sometimes that can be highly intrinsic in terms of your motivation, your kind of love of the subject, for instance. Resilience levels, we know that people have different levels of resilience, so might react differently to struggle over time. So I think we need to take into account the individual and how this might kind of interact almost with the environment. But certainly the environment plays a huge part, and as you touched on, it's teachers. Teachers are going to play a big part in that mathematical journey. And when we start to look at evidence, particularly qualitative, data, there are some common experiences amongst those who later on report as being highly maths anxious, and often that's in response to teachers who they might perceive as being quite low in empathy, for instance. So where teachers don't kind of recognise upset and those negative emotions, or perhaps react badly, and particularly teachers who might have a very kind of rigid approach to teaching as well, and not show that kind of willingness to tailor their teaching methods to suit the child or the student. So I think the teacher, in terms of their not just their teaching approach, but their general style, their demeanour even, can really influence the development of maths anxiety over time. But equally, pupils around other pupils as well. This kind of collective effect is something that we're starting to really look at as well. I don't want to say that there's a kind of social contagion effect, but this classroom effect clearly is there. It's present. So the higher the levels of maths anxiety in the classroom, the more likely you as an individual are to be more highly maths anxious yourself. So the extent to which that that occurs is really yet to be understood. The mechanisms for that need to be looked at really. But the classroom environment is one thing. I think the approach of the teacher is certainly another thing. And as you say, in terms of home life, the home numeracy environment is really important from a very young age in terms of how I think parents approach numerical things. That might be games, it might be conversations around mathematics. I think this can really develop and change children's relationship with maths and numbers in terms of how they approach things. So if they're approaching maths and numbers in a really positive way when they come to learning mathematics in a more formal setting, then it potentially kind of sets them up a little bit better, and maybe that develops their resilience as well. I think slightly speculative, but there's certainly evidence to demonstrate a more kind of negative home numeracy environment is linked to those more negative attitudes in children. And there's a developing body of evidence as well around parents' own maths anxiety and maths attitudes. And it's not always the case, but typically there is a relationship there in terms of the parents' own sort of self-beliefs and anxiety and attitudes and what we see in children. But it is a little bit more complex than that, because we need to start looking at, well, why is that there? There's some evidence to suggest there's even a genetic link, but the reality is, there's lots of day-to-day interactions when it comes to general numeracy at home, but also the more kind of formal mathematics as well. So when it comes to conversations around maths and particularly homework as well. And this is a really interesting one for me in terms of those almost physical interactions when it comes to homework. The body language, the speech, the tone, all of these kinds of things play a part in terms of approach to homework, in terms of developing certain attitudes and anxieties. And there's some really kind of mixed findings really in terms of maths anxious parents. Because some parents who are maths anxious, they want to avoid maths, and like many maths anxious people generally, they want to avoid the thing that makes them anxious in the first place. And the same goes for school-based maths. Somebody might have a child at school and they distance themselves from that mathematics. They might say, that's your mum's job or your dad's job.
I was going to say,
to deal with
sometimes it can be quite explicit, can't it? I don't do the maths. That's mum's job to do the maths.
Very open. I take a hands-off approach to this, and that in itself can sort of send a certain message. Equally, we might have parents who either at one point felt that they were maths anxious or even currently are very maths anxious, yet they want to make a concerted effort to avoid that being passed on, if you like, or their child going through that same experience. So their involvement in that their child's mathematics journey might be very different because of that, and they might be very involved. And there's, like I say, mixed evidence to suggest whether that's a good or a bad thing in many ways, and that's why it's so hard to sort of make recommendations really around parents' involvement in maths because of this mixed evidence.
Excuse me. So the recommendations really are, again, to look at the individual and take it on an individual basis. And that's one thing that keeps coming back through all the podcasts that I've done with the Primary Maths podcast and just speaking to experts in their field. That idea of the relationship between the teacher and the pupil being paramount. This just seems to be another example of that, really understanding the individual and being able to use that knowledge and understanding in order to support them. Yeah,
I would say so. And that really involves adults having that almost meta-awareness of their own self-beliefs, their own anxieties. We have these conversations regularly because it's something that we're involved in, but many people, they don't fully question their own attitudes or self-beliefs. They might have a general attitude, a general feeling. It might be a positive feeling or a negative feeling, but often that's not unpacked in terms of, what does that really mean? So I think spending the time to really have that understanding of yourself is really important. But also that full kind of gamut of psychological variables as well. It isn't just about the anxiety, it's about things like resilience, and even unpacking that really in terms of what that means, that sort of perceived importance of struggle, the perceived kind of importance or value attached to mathematics, things like motivation. I think the more that we have that understanding of ourselves in relation to something that's very domain specific like mathematics, puts us in a stronger position to then help others around us, whether that's our own children or the pupils that we teach.
I'm conscious we're running out of time now, and I could sit and talk to you all day about this sort of thing, but just reflecting on the work that you've done over 2 decades, as I say, in this field, is there a particular moment or story or piece of feedback or something that sticks with you to remind you of why this work matters?
Yeah. I occasionally get emails from parents who, for example, they might have read the book, or they've looked at some of the information on our website, and they will say, look, I've got a child, for instance, they've struggled for years with maths anxiety, and we've looked at this information, we've tried certain things out, and it's really made a big difference. And those little anecdotes really make a difference to me personally in terms of what I do. But equally, if I go into a college, for example, so a couple of times in the last few years, I've gone into a college where they have a high degree of resits in mathematics, and also a high percentage of pupils who don't even attend the exams. And mathematics sees it, an even higher level of non-attendance because of the anxiety around it. And speaking to the pupils directly, even for a relatively brief period of time, and talking about maths anxiety, like I say, generating that greater awareness of what it is, and maybe understanding your own feelings and maybe certain strategies that you can do to overcome the anxiety. That's been shown to work, and I've seen firsthand pupils attend a maths exam when they wouldn't have previously attended. So again, that sense of satisfaction is really great. So it's just as much about the sort of individual stories as the bigger picture really. But I think one thing that we really need to ensure is that we really try not to allow anxiety to develop like it can in some pupils. And obviously there are things that we can do to address anxiety as it stands, which is really important. But we really need to have that understanding of how the anxiety develops in the first instance. And a lot of that comes from, like I say, the environment itself, whether that's at home or in the classroom. And I think understanding the anxiety itself, what makes pupils anxious, having that individual awareness of how it's displayed as well is really important, because if we can really capture that before it gets out of hand, then that's when we can do something about it and sort of allow pupils to enjoy the subject like they do. We need to make sure that we foster that enjoyability, the curiosity, without the anxiety essentially overtaking that. And for me, that's a really important thing to get right early on.
I would certainly echo all of that. Thank you so much for your time today. Something we're passionate here at Twinkl about is raising awareness of these issues so that school leaders can start to implement changes if necessary in school. And I suppose one of my key takeaways really is that it's about supporting pupils on an individual level, and having an awareness of the potential problems, and then empathy in how they're dealt with really. And it comes back to all that work that schools are doing brilliantly around well-being, I think, in general, but making sure that feeds into the math side of things as well. So thank you so much for your time today. And for leaders listening, I think there's a real opportunity to shape the environment at school and the culture in school to ensure that our pupils can grow and that fear doesn't take root in maths classrooms. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll be back soon with another episode of the Leading With podcast.